Alright guys, Murph's here, and today I want to talk about kind of the part 2 of the Squad Designated Marksman concept video and really focus on features and aspects of a Squad Designated Marksman's Rifle that you kind of want to prioritize or look for whenever it is that you're putting one together or you're viewing one for purchase. Now, a couple like caveats and clarifications to go ahead and get out of the way right off the bat, guys. I am not telling you how to build your gun. Build it any way you see fit. Do whatever it is that you want to do. I'm not going to tell you how to spend your money. I'm not going to tell you what's going to work for your concept, what's not going to work for your concept. What I do want to share with you guys, though, are some observations that I've had from both putting designated marksman's rifles together as well as actually utilizing them in dynamic environments, and some things that I have assessed overall as being kind of key points of discussion, or perhaps some features or aspects of the rifle that you want to highlight and make sure that you really pursue. So this video is not necessarily meant for a person who's kind of been there, done that, and they know what it is they want and all that kind of stuff. This is more meant for the person who's looking to maybe try some new things, or perhaps experimenting with the concept for the first time on their own, and they're looking for a little bit of direction. They're sitting there, they're looking at all these options, and they're trying to figure out, what do I do? Where do I go? That's who this video is for. And in general, if you guys just want to have an interesting conversation about different aspects of application and maybe a little bit of a different point of view, we can of course do that as well. That's pretty much what we're doing here to begin with. All right, now, in order to have this discussion, we've already covered the kind of history aspect of it and talked about different weapon systems and all that kind of stuff throughout the development process. That was in the last video. And at some point, I'm also going to have a video unveiling my most recent Squad Designated Marksman Rifle. So there will be something specific for that once we get around to talking about that particular rifle. But for the most part, we're going to talk about two classifications of Designated Marksman's Rifle, and then two subcategories within each of those two divisions. So first off, starting off with the light category, because we have light and heavy categories, right? So light category are going to be weapon systems and an intermediate cartridge that are meant to kind of start picking up at around the 300 meter distance, and could be stretched out to 600 meters, which 3 to 6 is kind of that ground that we're looking to have a designated marksman be able to reach out to. These weapon systems are lighter weight, possibly using the same cartridge as everyone else in the squad, but are able to pick up an engagement capability beyond 300 meters, or perhaps running up to 300 meters, and depends on which category it is that we're looking at. So in the light category, we have two subdivisions. We have recce rifles and we have special purpose rifles. Now, recce rifles are, if you're looking at the classic definition, which is what the SEALs actually came up with, and naval surface warfare crane kind of standardized around, which was a 16-inch barreled AR-15 with a stainless steel barrel and a magnified optic. And the idea being is that it would be something still fairly portable. We're talking about a little bit heavier of a profile of a stainless steel barrel, but something a little more portable to the average infantryman, or to the average fighter. I guess in this case we would be talking about the average SEAL, that would still allow them to be able to engage a little bit further out, but not like 16 inches. Sure, can you push 16 inches to 500 yards? 100%, I do it all the time. However, I'm not necessarily giving the cartridge the best opportunity to deliver the maximum amount of energy to deliver that maximum amount of energy on target. That's kind of, I'm allowing a certain amount of trade-offs. Now, for the vast majority of people, we have 16-inch AR-15s. I would hazard a guess that the majority of us have at least one 16-inch AR-15 in our collection. And a lot of times, once you start pairing these rifles with magnified setups, you might go so far as to call it a recce rifle. And to some extent, you're not entirely wrong, but we will talk about a couple of different aspects as to how I would set up a recce rifle as opposed to a standard fighting rifle. Now, going from there, we start to talk about, and something else about engagement distance with recce rifle. So I would say that a recce rifle is probably more successful in consistent longer range engagements. So talking longer range in the terms of average engagement distances in combat would be like the 200 to 300. Already your average service rifle being of probably sub 14.5 inch barrels is expected to be able to gauge from 0 to 300. Well, if you're running into a condition where you're consistently having longer range engagements or needing better positive identification at those greater distances, you might, and you're still fighting sub 300, it just seems that everything's just a little bit further out, you might preference a recce rifle at that point for that 200 to 300 yard, meter, whatever engagement distance. I remember once upon a time, and I've mentioned this before, everyone was talking about how the average combat engagement distance in Afghanistan is 186 yards. That was getting thrown around a lot. That might be a condition where perhaps you preference a recce rifle for your purposes at that point. But once you start pushing out to from 3 to 6, maybe you would want to look at something more like a special purpose rifle, which is our other side of the lightweight category. So these are weapon systems. Again, we're still talking about an intermediate cartridge. We're talking about a fairly lightweight overall weapon system. However, now we're talking about an accurized M16A2, an accurized, optimized weapon system, kind of like a Mark 12 Mod 0 or 1. Where we started off with an M16 receiver. We then went ahead and put in an 18-inch stainless steel barrel, free-floated handguards, all that type of stuff, right? What makes the Mark 12 what it is now? Now, originally that was supposed to just be a receiver that you could swap onto any M4 as part of the SOP mod program. However, it was decided that in order to be able to ring out the best accuracy, they did want to go ahead and drop in a precision type trigger, which meant that they couldn't just drop it onto any old M4A1. So at that point it went from a special purpose receiver to a special purpose rifle. So that's when we're looking at trying to push the intermediate cartridge out from 300 meters to 600 meters. Now, of course, an intermediate cartridge doesn't perform terribly well at 600, but putting holes in someone's body that were not meant to be there to begin with is something that kind of helps out in a fight overall. So that's kind of how we evaluate that overall, guys. That's what we need to be looking at whenever we're talking about the special purpose rifle and the light end of the spectrum with the recce. Now, once we get into heavy, we have two subcategories in heavy. Now, heavy is going to be full power rifle cartridges, something that I'm looking to deliver a ton of energy out at this 300 to 600 meter fighting range, right? So in that, we have two subcategories. We have battle rifles, and then we have designated marksmen's rifles. So battle rifles are full power rifle cartridge weapon systems. They might have select fire capability. They have detachable box magazines. They're semi-automatic in nature. And these, at the very least, are semi-automatic in nature. And these were the forerunners to the adoption of intermediate cartridges throughout all of NATO. So we're talking about like G3s and M14s and stuff like that. So these rifles, a lot of times, once they got replaced by intermediate cartridges, would stick around because there was still an expectation that you would be able to project power to a greater distance, that you would have more energy to be able to project out to greater distances in a full power rifle cartridge like the 308. So these would hang around in a designated marksman's capability. Now, a lot of these would be There'd be a wide range. Some of it would just be taking something like a G3 and slapping a scope on it and calling it a designated marksman's rifle. It's not really that much more accurate than the average infantry arm. It just has a telescopic capability to allow you to be able to identify targets at a greater range. That's well within the designated marksman's wheelhouse. That's something that you'd expect them to be able to do. So it's not a big deal either way. Others, like perhaps the M14 with the EBR chassis, would eventually be optimized or attempt to be optimized better for their purpose. So now you're talking about, modular chassis system that you can adjust the length of pole and all this other kind of stuff that's supposed to accurize the system overall and give you better accuracy than the average infantry rifle. That is neatly fitting into the DMR category at that point, as previously outlined in other videos. Now, there's our battle rifle aspect, weapon systems pressed into service as designated marksmen's rifles, but were not necessarily initially developed to be so. We then have our designated marksmen's rifles, and these are from the ground up built full power rifle cartridges, at least for my definition purposes for today. These are from the ground built to be long range rifles. They are actively meant to have that engagement distance at the 500 and up. You're talking about full powered rifle cartridges, so you have a ton of energy on target, and they are accurized. They are purpose built in every aspect in order to be able to perform at these distances. They are more accurized. They are, better suited based off of optics choices and all that kind of stuff to be able to perform at these greater distances, and not necessarily well suited to performing in closer range engagements, which is one of the things that we have to keep in mind. The light division should be capable of being flexed into a close range type aspect. It might not be what you prefer to use it in, but you can if you're to be pressed. Whereas when we get in the heavies, you're talking about a lot of cartridge, you're talking about a lot of recoil, you're talking about heavier ammunition overall, so probably less of it available than a comparable intermediate cartridge chambered weapon system, as well as potential issues with overpenetration or being able to control it under rapid fire shot strings. This is not where the heavy category really wins out. They win out in this long range energy performance aspect, whereas the light division doesn't necessarily have that going for it. It can still lay in shots how it needs to. It's still an accurate overall weapon system. It just doesn't have the energy relationship that a full power rifle cartridge does at the same distances, but you can better utilize it in close range scenarios should you need to. So that's kind of the spectrum that we're on right now. Let's go ahead and start talking about different aspects of weapon systems that make them better suited or optimized for their different situations. Let's talk about features now. All right, so first off, barrels. Barrels are so important in this aspect overall. If you're talking about a fighting rifle, you can play around with different aspects of barrels, right? You can preference a heavier profile barrel to, have less of an overheating issue so your handguards don't heat up too fast, and you wind up needing gloves and kind of doing a Michael Jackson thing with the weapon system overall and all that kind of stuff in order to be able to fight effectively with it. Or perhaps you want a lighter weight barrel because you want to have a lighter weight overall weapon system because you're going to walk with it more than you're necessarily going to engage with it. You don't have this situation, in my own opinion, and this is of course something that's open to interpretation, you don't have the same opportunity with designated marksmen's rifles. You want them to have heavier barrels. You want them to be better suited for giving you precision accuracy at distance. Now, barrel lengths, things vary. So with recce rifles, like this is probably the closest I have to a recce rifle. This is my Spikes Tactical Crusader lower with the CBC upper, previously reviewed on the channel. This has a barrel profile similar to like a Daniel Defense strength to weight ratio type setup. It's a Colt competition profile barrel. I get excellent accuracy out of this rifle. However, overall with this profile, this is better suited to being a fighting rifle than it is to being a recce rifle based off of barrel profile. Now, it is a 16-inch barrel. You'll see 14.5s and 13.7s pressed into this category as well. I would not consider those to be the best overall application of this process. I would sooner see a heavier profile 16-inch barrel in a recce rifle. Same with the 308s, same with the SPRs, whatever it is that you want to look at, a heavier profile barrel, in my opinion, is the better overall option. Regardless of whether or not you're trying to go like clone specific or anything like that, if you're talking about greater performance, you're going to want a heavier profile barrel. Now, I don't want to say contour, but barrel material. Now, a lot of these weapon systems, when they were initially developed, would utilize stainless steel barrels, and you see this quite a bit. Stainless steel is not necessarily my favorite barrel material. I don't hate it, and if it's done properly, I actually quite like it, but it's not necessarily something that I pursue. If you're going to do a stainless steel barrel, excellent. It's going to give you great accuracy. You may have to worry a little bit about longevity of the barrel overall. Just something to take into consideration. And as much as it does take stainless steel a little bit longer to heat up, it also takes it longer for it to shed its heat. So that's something to take into account as well. My preference in any barrel steel is still 4150 chrome moly vanadium. That's my favorite steel. I like its longevity. Where it starts to get negotiable in this aspect is when we start to talk about coated bores, because typically a bore that does not have any type of coating applied to it is actually more accurate. You get a better overall contact and friction with the projectile, which gives you better stability and greater velocity, all that kind of stuff, whenever it is that you're punching out to greater range. That's the thing that we need to be worried about, punching out to greater overall range. Maybe not so much at the recce end of the spectrum, which is definitely the light of the light, but definitely as we move through Mark 12 and all the way up to the DMR itself, we want to do everything we can to give it an accuracy advantage. However, I like longevity in my system, so I have a tendency to go for 4150 cold hammer forged barrels and some type of barrel coating. Now, there's lots of different options you can go with. If you're going with a little bit less expensive of a barrel, I would highly recommend going with like QPQ or melanite finishes, whatever type of actual barrel treatment that changes the metallurgy or metal aspects of the barrel. I'm not that fluent on metals and their terms and all that kind of stuff, but something that actually does like a chemical change to the barrel itself and increases the hardness that way. Only because you're going to get a consistent coating as opposed to chrome lining, which if done incorrectly can really play with your accuracy. Now, there are plenty of manufacturers out there who make high quality barrels with excellent chrome line bores. 100%, not saying that they don't. Just saying that it's something that you have to keep an eye out for, and you want to check a lot of reviews, you want to get a lot of customer feedback and see how people's barrels have been performing and whether or not you're actually going to get the accuracy that you want to get out of it. Just a key thing there. All right, so that covers barrel contour and that covers materials. We go ahead and cover twist rate real quick. 1 in 7s if you're going at the lighter end of the spectrum. And on the heavier end of the spectrum, I'm actually not that picky about twist. Now, twist on the 1 in 7s. You're going to want to try to run 77 grainers. And of course, you're going to want to have something that'll still stabilize 55 grain ammunition because, let's face it, ammunition's expensive. But you're going to want that heavier bullet profile in an intermediate cartridge, specifically the 5.56, and we'll talk about others here in a little bit, in order to be able to get that greater long-range performance. And we'll talk about that more once we get to the ammunition aspect. It was just important to go ahead and cover twist rate. Now, in the heavy end of the spectrum, I'm not as worried about twist rate, primarily because already I'm throwing out a more powerful bullet. I'm throwing out a bigger bullet. I'm throwing out something that's going to carry more energy to begin with. So as long as I get a piece of the guy, I still win. Now, sure, we could split hairs about the accuracy aspect and all that kind of stuff, but as long as I'm getting better than service rifle accuracy, I'm happy with the Designated Marksmens Rifle. Probably an unpopular opinion, but I don't really care because ultimately that's all I need a DMR to do is to be a more precise service rifle. That's why battle rifles are a thing. That's why slightly optimized battle rifles are a thing in the heavy category. All right, let's talk about gas system. Cover that real quick. I would prefer to have the softest shooting gas system I can for the barrel length I have. So in a 16-inch barrel, you're probably looking at like a mid-length gas system. In an 18-inch barrel, you're looking at a rifle length gas system. And then that kind of gets a little bit wonky once we get into kind of the service rifle type setup. Now, when it comes to piston, my first inclination is to not choose piston-driven systems for Designated Marksmens Rifles. However, it has been done multiple times and with mixed success. Kind of like with this PSL 54C out of Romania, previously reviewed on the channel. So, excellent rifle. Great design, piston-driven systems, more or less an overgrown AK, and this is a long stroke piston. Now, what is my existential issue with piston-driven systems in a Designated Marksmens Rifle category? Well, right now we're trying to optimize it for accuracy. And when you consider that piston-driven systems have a function, an action that starts here and transitions disruption all across the weapon system, all the way to the rear of the path of the bolt and all that kind of stuff, be it long stroke or short stroke, doesn't matter. You still have a wiggle, basically, in the rifle that starts up here and extends all the way to the rear, from here to here. That's a lot of disruption to your shot. That's a lot of recovery, potentially, on your shot. So, with that being the case, you're potentially disturbing your sight picture so much you cannot stack accurate follow-on shots. It's one of the issues with piston-driven systems. I've talked about that previously on this channel as well. That doesn't mean that you can't do it successfully. That means that you're going to have to try a little bit harder. Now, theoretically, at the very least, in the longer range setup, and kind of the heavy side of things, you could sell me on the idea that perhaps your engagements are a little bit slower. You've got somebody picked out at 550 meters, let's say, and you can bear down on that guy and take that shot and then read your shot, see what happened, recover, and then be able to take that next shot or whatever it is that you have going on there at that point. You'll work around that target. It's not like we're at close range inside of a house and you're trying to pump rounds into somebody really fast and you need that muzzle to recover quickly so that you can keep getting those sight pictures and really drive through that target. In a long range aspect, it's not nearly as critical. Somebody's not going to potentially be on top of you with a knife or something like that. They are at a greater distance. You can take the time to recover and squeeze off those good shots. Potentially. Every situation is different. Just saying that this is where this would be less of a hindrance to have a external gas piston system. For the most part, I would prefer internal gas in the AR-15 and AR-10 setups. All right, let's talk about muzzle devices. So, for the most part, I'm not too worried about what you use for muzzle devices. My own kind of, I guess you could say, preferences kind of show out at this point. I don't care for muzzle brakes. For the most part, I avoid muzzle brakes unless for some reason something about a build or a setup makes me run towards a muzzle brake. Kind of like on this Mark 12 Mod Murph, as I refer to it, which if I haven't posted the video yet on the channel, it's coming here shortly. This has the Ops number 12 muzzle brake and collar system. And I got this for two reasons. One, the barrel was cut for it. And two, I really like taper lock muzzle devices, and that's what this is. This unthreads right here. Which reminds me, I didn't. They were all checked before the video, but you know, sometimes people get a little weird about things. But I have my threaded portion right here. I can thread the muzzle device on, or I can thread the suppressor on, and then it moves against this collar right here, which allows it to center, and then I have consistent placement of the suppressor, which means that I will have less shift in my accuracy overall. And if you're going to run suppress, which I don't discourage on designated marksman type rifles, you're going to want repeatable contact with the suppressor so that you don't have to account for zero shift. And that's going to be a very key thing. So stuff like direct thread, not going to be a good choice. But if you have some sort of centering system incorporated with your muzzle device, that's really going to help out. It's the only reason I have a muzzle brake on this rifle here. If I'm going to be doing indoor fighting type things, I don't want muzzle brakes. I don't want to give myself and everyone else around me a concussion. Had them before, they're not fun. So I have a tendency to prefer to use flash hiders. I'm fine with the A2 compensators. They're not that drastic of a compensator, and they work pretty effectively at hiding flash without disturbing everybody. But that's going to be something that I preference on rifles that I'm fighting indoors with. The problem with taking something like this rifle and trying to fight indoors with it is this is a whole lot of rifle, first off, but I'm also talking about a full power rifle cartridge, which this specifically is chambered in the 7.62 by 5.4. Not that it's impossible to run this thing in a sort of shoot and move type aspect here, but in order to be able to tame this down, it does have a muzzle brake, and that is going to be very concussive indoors. That's not a good use for this being kind of in that battle rifle type designation, kind of straddling the line between battle rifle and designated marksman's rifle. That's why I would not recommend using those in indoor type functions. If that's what you expect to be doing, a 308 or 6.5 Creedmoor or whatever caliber full power rifle cartridge is not going to be successful in that overall. I'm sure there's plenty of people who've done it. I'm sure there are plenty of people who swear by it. I'm saying that I would not opt for that right off the bat. I would sooner run something like my Mark 12 or something like a recce rifle in order to be able to perform that same type of function. So that's where I'm at on muzzle devices. Definitely would preference something that will work with a suppressor and have repeatable contact service overall. Now, handguards. Handguards should be fairly obvious. We're going to want free float whenever possible. Cut down, you know, have a good association with barrel harmonics, all that kind of stuff, be able to get that great repeatable accuracy, especially if the weapon system heats up for whatever reason. All right, cool. Now, cartridges. Let's talk about cartridges. So, for the most part, when we talk about the light side of things, I think in terms of 5.56. And that's purely because the ammunition is available and it's relatively inexpensive, and I have a wide variety of options in it overall. This is where we get back to that 77s thing. Now, the problem with 77 grain ammunition is that it's expensive. So you also want to be able to flex down in like the 55, 62 grain range so that you have something fairly inexpensive to take to the range and practice your fundamentals and all that kind of stuff. And then 77 grain ammunition available in maybe a diminished overall capacity so that you can utilize the weapon system for what it is that you want to use it for. Target, you know, actual competition or fighting or whatever it is that you're planning on designating this for, you're going to want the heavier end of the spectrum of the ammunition on hand. Something to keep in mind about 77 grain ammunition at 500 meters is that it hits with about the same force as a 357 Magnum. You're just doing so with a smaller overall cartridge. So that's the advantage that 77 grain has over 62. Right off the bat. That's a lot more energy. Out of like 55 grain ammunition, you're getting like a 9mm out of a 22 caliber projectile. It still holes in somebody's body that they didn't want to be there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that person's never going to be a threat again. especially if they can get to some level of care. You might run into them in the future in whatever scenario it is that you have playing out that you're utilizing these weapon systems, professional, personal, whatever, I don't care. Now, when we talk about other intermediate cartridges, we'll go ahead and focus on the light end of the spectrum for the moment here. 7.62x39 has been pressed into this kind of special purpose rifle position, and I'm not saying that a cartridge is inherently inaccurate as much as I think you end up finding the weapon system a lot more often in the 7.62x39 category than you do in, say, 5.56 or 6.5 Grendel or 6.8 SPC. Now, the issue with those cartridges, again, comes back to cost as well as modularity of the system overall to be able to actually refine it to what it is that you want. Great cartridges, I'm not saying that they aren't, I'm just saying that they haven't really caught on and that there's quite a few issues that arise whenever you're running a cartridge that hasn't gotten mainstream adoption. Now, 224 Valkyrie and 6mm arc, I've heard a lot of things. They sound like they're kind of built to actually project beyond what it is that we're generally designating for these types of rifles. But I would be concerned about cost, and I would be concerned about how much energy they're actually delivering at these greater overall distances. I haven't researched them that much. I haven't had a lot of interest in them, if I'm being completely honest. It sounds like a lot of niche type stuff to where 5.56 consistently sticks around because it's an effective cartridge for its purpose. And that's kind of hard to argue with overall, especially when you start to talk about the cost value association. Now, in the heavy category, my preference is 308, if I'm being completely honest. The 6.5 Creedmoor definitely has a niche. However, the 6.5 Creedmoor was kind of designed to work in bolt action rifles, which means that you have a little bit of a difference to the design of the actual cartridge casing, which gives it some feeding issues in the AR-10 platform. And that's one of my issues with it overall. I've been observing 6.5 Creedmoor AR-10s since they came out, and I have yet to find one that has had a flawless reliability record. And as much as you kind of run into that issues in general with full power rifle cartridges in the AR-10 platform, it's very concerning to me in 6.5 Creedmoor when you also take into account how much the cartridge costs. As much as I think it's a fantastic long-range cartridge, I don't think it fully beats out the 308. Now, of course, you also have cartridges like the 7.62x54, which are fun, they're interesting, they're relatively inexpensive, but in order to really get the best out of the cartridge, you do wind up having to go to the more costly end of the spectrum. Whereas 308, you have a wide variety of options that you can get literally whatever it is that your flavor is. Now, one of the other things that I would throw out there that I've observed, and it kind of comes back to gas system, is tunable gas systems. From what I've been able to observe, that seems to be very important in the AR-10 platform, which is pretty solidly what we're talking about whenever we talk about DMRs, or this heavy end of the spectrum for the squad designated marksman concept. Adjustable gas blocks become extremely important in actually being able to tune the system to make sure that you have enough gas to operate. But it becomes a sustainability issue if you start switching ammunition back and forth to where you have to be concerned as to whether or not your gas block is actually properly tuned. And that's going to take experimentation on your part and possibly rigorous notes. I'm not saying that it's not a good use, I'm saying that it's something that you have to keep in mind. Like this rifle, absolutely fantastic with the light end of the 7.62x54, but it was never built with some of the heavier, like 180 grain or even heavier than that ammunition, and it'll beat itself to death if you don't put a K&S Precision adjustable gas block on it, which I have not on this one because I want to keep it original. That's literally the only reason. So something to kind of keep in mind whenever it is that you're playing around with these different ends of the spectrum right now. Things that you have to take into account, because you don't necessarily have to be worried about that in the intermediate cartridges. They're generally going to run exactly how it is that you want them to run. You can put adjustable gas blocks on them if you want, but I'm not a big fan of adjustable gas blocks to begin with, so I like systems that just work. And if it means that they're maybe a little overgassed in order to make sure that they just work, I can live with that. Absolutely, 100%. All right, cool. So that was cartridge. Let's go ahead and let's start talking about optics. So optics become a very interesting discussion because this is highly subjective based off of your budget, what you're used to, as well as what your actual purpose is. So, for recce rifles, and this will just be what we use to insert to talk about recce rifles. This is not a recce rifle to me, by any means. I don't like the barrel profile for it, as mentioned before. When it comes to optics on a recce rifle, I'm just looking for magnification. So an ACOG would be perfectly acceptable on a recce rifle. It allows you to be able to get that greater positive identification from the 200 to 300 yard range and beyond if need be. And it allows you to be able to push the cartridge beyond with actually, if you've never looked at an ACOG reticle, it's actually a really excellent reticle. The Chevron one is the one I prefer, but everyone's got their own flavor. It doesn't really matter in this case. ACOGs are an excellent use as long as, I would stick with the 4 power and up, honestly. Good clear glass, all that kind of stuff, durable optic overall, unless you give it to Marines. Now, another really great option in recce rifles starts to become your variable power optics. 1 to 4, obviously, we already identified that 4 power was good. Well, 1 to 4 has got to be better. You have a 1 magnification at that point. You can work at closer range if you so choose. This is a 1 to 6, and I absolutely love the 1 to 6 because it's a great trade-off between the actual weight of the optics system, as well as I have a workable reticle, I have magnification in order to better be able to identify a target, as well as be able to dial back down to 1 so that I can run close range if I need to. That's pretty cool. Now, with advancements in optics, we have up to like 1 to 10s. That's a lot of magnification, and that works out pretty good on a recce rifle, though I think it might be a tad heavy. Just a tad too much magnification overall. I think 1 to 6 is a really good sweet spot. Maybe 1 to 8, 1 to 10 is a tad overpowered. Now, once we get into, because one of the greatest things about, the 1 to whatever is that you have that low end to be able to fight close range, which is what this type of rifle should be able to flex into, as well as, in my opinion, a Mark 12. So on this particular rifle, I have a 2 to 7 by 32 crossfire with the BDC reticle. Now, we'll focus on magnification first, then we'll talk about reticles. But I think you should not exceed 4 power on the low end of power for an SPR. Anything below 4 power, like a fixed 4 power, in my own personal opinion, is not a good use of a special purpose rifle. Having like a 4 to 12 or something like that is the absolute highest that I would go on the low end. If you had like a 6 to 24 on this particular rifle, I would tell you that you probably need to step up to a full power rifle instead of an intermediate cartridge. However, if you're dealing with the lighter end at like 3 to 9, which were very popular on these rifles at one point, the 2 to 7, those types of realms, you've got good magnification as well as being able to dial it back so that you can work at closer range if you need to. And that's a very key aspect. With this 2 power, I have a very forgiving eye box, and I can actually move the scope around a barrier should I need to and shoot from some suboptimal positions because I have such a forgiving eye box. And that's kind of a key thing with the 1 powers on the recce's as well. If you're trying to fight in closer range situations, you're going to want that forgiving eye box. So that's why I like this 2 to 7 that's on this particular rifle, and why I really wouldn't go much past 3 to 9. In my own personal opinions. Now, in battle rifles, it's the same kind of deal overall between battle rifles and your actual DMRs. 4 power is the absolute lowest you should go on the low end. And you should only be going up from there. So 4 to 12s, 4 to 16s, whatever it may be, those are excellent optics to mount on those because you're primarily concerned with those longer range engagements and being able to apply that greater overall firepower at that greater distance. You're going to want to be able to zoom in. So at this point, if we're utilizing those types of rifles, we're possibly in a long range engagement expecting to be fighting across open fields or from ridge to ridge type of deal. And I want to make sure that I can zoom in, get that positive ID, and then start laying in those rounds, making adjustments as necessary to be able to connect with that target. One other thing that I would say about full power rifle cartridges is that in an urban environment, they do a great job of compromising somebody's cover. But that's a lot of rifle to lug around just for the purpose of compromising somebody's cover. We'll talk more about weight here after a little bit. Now, of course, in some of your battle rifles, you might have, if you're going for kind of a period correct type rifle, you might have things like this 6 power optic or a 4 power optic or something like that mounted on these rifles. It's better than nothing. I just don't necessarily think it's the best application in current trends of the system overall. So like this optic's not going anywhere. This is going to remain on this rifle because this is actually a 4 to 6. I actually really like Hey, 4x6 is what I said. It's what I should have said. This is actually a fantastic reticle for what it is that it needs to do. It's a fantastic power for what it is that it needs to do. But more importantly, it's also period correct for the rifle, and that's what I want to keep this in. This is not a serious use rifle for me, as much as it's something that I can flex into a roll if I were to be pressed to do so. I wanted greater overall firepower. Now let's talk about reticles. In my opinion, you need some type of data to work off of, but you don't need an excessive amount of data. You don't need like crazy Christmas trees going on inside of your reticle. I like something that gives me enough workable data to be able to make adjustments, and maybe I have to make 1 or 2 corrections before I connect with this target. I'm not performing in a sniper's capacity, I'm performing in a designated marksman's capacity. So it's okay if every round is not 1 shot, 1 kill. It's okay if I have to make little adjustments. It's okay if I perhaps have to, pursue that target a little bit longer than perhaps your average well-trained sniper would be able to fulfill. Just something to consider overall. Hey guys, also remember that like the long range shots that snipers have made, these ridiculous over a mile shots that they've been making, were not single round engagements. Quite a few of them were multiple rounds because the rifles that they're using to be able to reach out that far are not necessarily precision rifles. So something to keep in mind overall. Sometimes just being able to get the energy out there and then make the corrections on the fly is just as good as taking them out on the first round. If you're not projecting power there to begin with, and then you're in a better position than not, overall. All right, now, let's go ahead and talk about backup sighting systems. This is something that, again, really gets into personal preference. Myself, I think it comes down to how your optic is arranged and kind of where it is that you're working. Now, if you're working in a close range type scenario, having a fast throw lever like this TrueGlow Omnia 1:6 has is pretty clutch because you need to be able to quickly dial between these distances. But if something happens to this optic, you need to be able to remove it quickly if you're going to run standard backup iron sights. So like I'm actually deficient on that in this particular rifle, in that I have no way to be able to quickly remove this setup to be able to get access to my iron sights. It's something I'm going to address. But some sort of QD mount would be the preferred. That way, if you get this thing clogged up with mud and you can't, like, regardless of what the optic is, even if it's a red dot, if you can't view through the optic, it is useless to you to have backup irons like this. So some sort of quick detach mount would be really important to be able to get that out of the way so that you can employ your irons and continue the fight. Now, something else that you might consider, especially if you don't have a fast throw lever yet or for whatever reason, is some sort of rollover optic system. Like here I have a Sig Sauer Romeo 5. Now, my friends and I debated back and forth about this for quite a bit because I have 2 friends with 45-degree offset sights. Just theirs are irons, mine is a red dot now. And what they brought up was that irons are great because they're a mechanical backup to an electronic system or to some sort of finicky type system, like something open to potential damage, like a magnified optic. And that way your iron sights, they won't break unless they break off completely. And that is the theory. However, when we're talking about engagement type aspects with a rifle, so I'm sitting here and let's say I'm dialed up for a longer range shot. I'm sitting here, I got my scope dialed up to 7, I'm hitting this, target, hitting this target, and then I have something pop up where it's much closer and I cannot effectively view it with my 7 power optic, but I need to get rounds on target immediately and I don't have time to break my weld and dial it back down to 2. What I can do is roll over. Well, this is kind of a suboptimal shooting position. I'm not saying it's impossible. It shoots just fine. I've been able to group it and zero it and all that kind of stuff and consistently engage with it. But when I roll over on iron sights, I have 2 focal points I have to align on the target, as opposed to just picking up a dot without even really having to move my cheek weld at this point. I pretty much just keep my head stationary, roll the rifle, and there's my dot. That allows me to engage immediately. And in addition to that, if I'm using this weapon system or like a recce rifle in close range type fighting, if I transition shoulders, I can still view that red dot easily. In fact, if anything, it's actually a little bit easier to view that red dot with it being offset than it is when it's centrally located on the rifle, which allows me to be able to fight from, again, suboptimal positions. Working around a barrier, same kind of deal. Suboptimal positions, so that if I don't have the time to dial down to get that better eye box, I have a really good backup system that allows me to keep fighting. Now, does it run on batteries? Yes. I'm having a really bad day if my primary optic is damaged or down and my red dot battery dies. I should reevaluate my life at that point. Just something to think about overall. All right, now other types of accessories. Oh yeah, and then also on this rifle, you can dip just below this optic so that you can view your iron sights to be able to use those as a backup type sighting system, which is very nice. And you know, there we get kind of that aspect of having this repeatable thing that doesn't necessarily, you know, have batteries die, or for some reason the, you know, the recoil on, say, like a Scar 17 causes the optic to eat itself. Sorry, the wife's headed out to get groceries. Let me just pause this for a second. So that was actually a pretty good spot to segue though, because now we can get back into talking about different accessories that are attached. Now, accessories are going to massively depend on which end of the spectrum we're working right now. So we get into the light category yet again. We talk about recce rifles. Recce rifles are still fighting rifles. They're just fighting rifles that have a designated niche for greater overall engagement range, right? So having lights and, you know, if you're running NVGs, some sort of IR designator, that makes perfect sense on a recce rifle. However, if we're coming over to a Mark 12, it does not make as much sense at that point, except for the IR designator, just because you still need to have a night fighting capability. But flashlights and all that kind of stuff, that's not the purpose of the guy behind this rifle. I would not recommend the added weight to be able to have that capability that you wouldn't utilize this person for. This guy is covering the assault force. He's not necessarily on the assault force. Now, that doesn't mean that he's not going to eventually collapse into the building that the assault force takes, but he's providing overwatch, not necessarily room clearing type capabilities. So you wouldn't necessarily expect him to be able to illuminate buildings and all that kind of stuff. It's not really his purpose. However, a bipod might make a lot of sense. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't make sense on a recce rifle, but that's added weight that doesn't necessarily pair with its overall purpose, as opposed to this kind of running a middle ground at that point when it comes to stabilizing for longer range shots and all that kind of stuff. And that transcends up into the battle rifle and into the Designated Marksmens Rifle as well. These are weapon systems that probably are going to benefit from having some type of bipod for stabilization. So something to consider whenever we're talking about that as well. And then again, laser designators, because you are still going to want, if you have a night fighting capability, to be able to express that night fighting capability at, you know, in the dark. Now, of course, laser designators are incredibly expensive, and you still don't even get the full power capability of the military's laser designators, but it's still better than nothing. It's better than spitwads, that's for sure. Now, let's talk about weight. Throughout this, weight has kind of been that fringe factor that we need to talk about on the back end of things. I expect a recce rifle to still be as lightweight as we can get away with. This rifle comes in at like 7 pounds with a little bit heavier barrel profile and maybe a couple other things optimized for it. Perhaps we're pushing 7.5 pounds. That's still pretty lightweight overall for a fighting rifle. This Mark 12, as you see it outfitted here, weighs 9.2 pounds. That's getting kind of heavy. It's definitely at the heavier end of the spectrum overall. I can tell you that even though this is very heavy, based on how this rifle is laid out, it actually, especially when I take the bipod off, it actually handles like a much lighter rifle. And I think it's because there's really good weight distribution across the system overall. It is well balanced, which makes that weight swing and transition very naturally. It makes it really easy to work with overall. So as much as I know this gun is heavy, I don't feel that weight nearly as much as I have in different battle rifle and squad designated marksman, or excuse me, designated marksman rifles in the past. So things like the M14 EBR. Really cool weapon system. It looks super cool. It's a lot of fun to shoot. It's a lot of fun to play around with. However, it's heavy and it's not necessarily optimized for backup iron sights and all that kind of stuff, to where I would not choose to fight with one of those if the scenario called for close range engagements. But if you're talking about engaging near those greater distances, completely fine with it. This rifle, I would be completely fine with engaging with this out to greater distances overall. I would not want to fight with it in close range. This rifle, I have absolutely no problem with fighting in close range with, but if I don't have a choice in my ammunition, I'm going to be a little finicky about trying to push it out to 5 or 6. I feel completely comfortable with this rifle at 4. I even feel positive that I can hit the targets out to 5 and 6. The proper delivery of energy, that's the thing that starts to get me. That's what I become worried about overall for a weight trade-off. Now, in the battle rifle concept, I will say that the Scar 17 is a fantastic lightweight option that also has ridiculous accuracy. And that brings us into the accuracy discussion. I mentioned it before. I'm fine as long as it is better than a combat rifle's accuracy. Well, what's combat accuracy? It's about 4 MOA. 4-inch groups at 100 yards. That's a lot. That's big. That's huge. It's not that hard to beat. However, that's the only thing that I really specify on that. If we're talking about a sniping rifle, I would want a greater level of accuracy, but we're just talking about being able to project PID and potential fight-stopping ballistics at greater distance. 4 MOA will perform at the same distances that we're talking about. However, slightly better than 4 MOA is going to be more successful in this regard overall. So like this rifle, I've seen as small as 1.5 out of it. I've been consistently getting closer to 2.5, something along those lines. And that's been with 55 and 62 grain ammunition. As of the time of filming this, I've not had a chance to run 77s through it. I'll update you guys when I do. The best group I've ever gotten out of this rifle was just under 2 MOA. But I would have no issue with pushing this out to greater distance. This rifle performs just fine. It does exactly what I need it to do in order to be able to function. Sometimes we get too wrapped around the axle on accuracy. We need to think about what accuracy means. 4 MOA means that you're able to engage a 12-inch target at 300. That's still within a man's chest. That's a win. That is 100% a win. And the more we go below 4 MOA, the further we push that man-sized target engagement capability out to greater distances. That's all we have to worry about in that case. That's the real-world application of MOA at that point. That's what we got to keep in mind. All right, guys. I talked about this at great length. It's definitely been one of the longer videos I've done in a while. I hope you guys found this interesting and insightful. And that's pretty much what I have for you. So, if you guys have a designated marksman setup, let me know about it. But up until then, have a good day.